Mario, Triforce, Gaming, Patty Dots, Gaming, Patty Dots. Hello everyone, today I will be presenting to you the top 10 hardest dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series. Something to note is that this list is my opinion, so don't hate me if a dungeon you found easy is on this list, or if your number one pick only made my honorable mentions list. Also, I haven't played every dungeon in the series, so if a dungeon that you found difficult deserves to be on this list, leave a comment telling me what it is, and I will reply with one of two things. The first is that I found that dungeon to be too easy for this list, and the second one is that I've never played that dungeon before. With all that out of the way, let's get started. In 10th place, I have selected Dungeon 3 from the original Zelda. I find the classic Zelda games to be very difficult, and the original was no exception. For me, I think the layout of this dungeon is very weird and confusing. Also, I have trouble with combat in the majority of the first Zelda, which added to the difficulty of this place. Finding out where all the keys are is very frustrating. So, why isn't it higher on this list? The reason is this dungeon starts off quite easy. It only gets hard after the first few rooms. Dungeon 2 from the original Zelda is actually quite unmemorable. To remember the layout and design of this place, I had to go back and revisit some of the dungeon until I remembered everything. What I can say is that this dungeon features some of the weirdest enemies in the game, which can be hard to defeat and are quite annoying. Also, the path branches out a lot, making it hard to figure out where to go, or which doors lead to where. It's not overly impossible, but it's certainly challenging for someone like me who has a hard time with the classics. So, the PAPARA Palace. The first few times I tried out this place, I kept dying like crazy. The layout confused me and I didn't know about many sword techniques, which made this dungeon practically impossible to beat. However, I've gotten better at it, and now I can provide a pretty smooth run through this place, especially since I now have strategies to defeat every enemy in this dungeon. So why is it even on the list if I don't find it that hard anymore? The reason is because of those first impressions. First, let me get this out of the way. The Sky Keep from Skyward Sword is my all-time favorite dungeon in the series. But now is not the time to talk about why. It's time to talk about why this dungeon is hard. We'll start with moving rooms around. It will easily confuse a lot of people when doing it, since it's hard to know which room you have to be in. The dungeon is also non-linear, which will make it difficult because there are many ways to go. So when you're playing through this dungeon, you may think that there is only one way to complete it. That is not true. As long as you're making progress, you're doing it correctly. Also, the rooms themselves feature puzzles that will require you to hop between every item you possess, which will challenge you with what you're supposed to do. We will be doing plenty of things in this dungeon, and each one will provide a fair amount of challenge. The Skyview Temple from Skyward Sword. Nintendo, what were you thinking when you made this game? You obviously thought it was a good idea to make the first dungeon the hardest one in Skyward Sword, because that's exactly what you did. Well, from my perspective, there aren't any other dungeons in the game that are harder. I'll tell you why now by looking through the rest of them. Earth Temple? Nah. Linear Mining Facility? Got past it fine. Ancient Cistern, nothing stood out in terms of difficulty. Sandship had quite a few tough moments, but I got through it. Fire Sanctuary, nope, that one was easy. Skykeep, well, it certainly was tough, but I knew it would be hard. Anyway, back to the Skyview Temple. It has stuff in it that you find by looking everywhere. If you don't see some small things, this place will haunt you. Also, there are lots of little secrets to find. The dungeon also branches out quite a bit. A first dungeon usually eases you into the game, but in my opinion this is an exception. Please don't do this to me again. The Sky Temple from Triforce Heroes. Were you expecting this to show up? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if your answer is no. It's a dungeon that was first playable a couple of months ago, so it's not that popular yet. Anyways, how is the dungeon hard? It's a place which is mainly just combat and fighting a series of enemies in places that resemble the different areas in the game. Sounds easy, but it's not. The enemies are some of the most advanced in Triforce Heroes, but it's a final dungeon, so I was expecting something challenging. On that note, this dungeon does what it's supposed to. It's a final dungeon that challenges you with difficult enemies. However, the reason that it didn't crack the top 4 is the fact that every item in the game is available to you in this place, which makes it a bit easier to play out a strategy than usual. Still, that's only a little thing. This dungeon is tough. The Wind Temple from Wind Waker. Underneath Gale Isle lies the only Wind Waker dungeon on this list. After the Earth Temple, I was expecting a challenging dungeon, but not something overly difficult. However, this dungeon is much harder than the Earth Temple. Some of the puzzles in here are quite hard. It makes you think of new ways to use your items, and you will need to find out how to use Makar by playing around with him. Also, the main room is massive, and there are many ways to go, which makes navigating the dungeon extremely confusing. The mini-boss and boss are also very tough. You may think of other Wind Waker dungeons that should have made the list, but for me the Wind Temple jumped to the highest in terms of difficulty. The Great Bay Temple from MAJORA'S Mask. Water dungeons are usually very confusing, and I'd be lying if I said the Great Bay Temple is an exception, because it's not. Some of the puzzles are tricky, but the main thing that brought this dungeon up to number 3 on my list is the fact that this place is incredibly difficult to navigate. It has rooms that branch out a lot, and you have no clue where to go. There are also lots of switches that may change the water current. However, it's easy to lose track of which ones you've pressed, which again makes it harder. Also, if you're going for all 15 stray fairies, they are hard to find. Still, you should go for them, because the upgrade is pretty rewarding. The last hard thing about this dungeon is the boss. I died quite a few times on it, which was wasting time in the 3-day cycle. Overall, this is a very difficult dungeon. The hardest one in MAJORA'S Mask. The Palace of Darkness from A Link to the Past. This dungeon is a nightmare. Not only do I hate this place, it's also extremely difficult. The layout of this place is very confusing. Just like the Great Bay Temple, sometimes you have no idea where to go. However, the biggest reason why this is number 2 is that there are so many keys. I don't know how many times I had no keys left and I came across a locked door. I would check the entire dungeon only to not find anything. And that's because they are hidden. They're in some of the weirdest places. Also, the combat in this place can be quite challenging with certain enemies. To wrap up this entry, I think the first 4 dungeons in the game are very easy, but they chose to provide a step up in difficulty for the 5th one. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I wasn't expecting something this brutal, and to think we're only at number 2. Alrighty, before we get to number 1, let's take a look at a few honorable mentions. The Water Temple from Ocarina of Time. Wow! As soon as you step in here, they immediately leave you with not knowing what to do. This is easily the hardest dungeon in the series. There are places everywhere, and this entire time you have no clue what to do or where to go. If you find somewhere to go that leads to a locked door, you'll usually need to backtrack just to search the entire dungeon for a key. In that respect, this place is just like the Palace of Darkness. This place also includes changing the water level, and sometimes you don't know where the water is supposed to be. And whenever you finally figure out a puzzle or find out where you're supposed to go, you'll be satisfied for 2 seconds before being slapped in the face with another problem. This dungeon is incredibly brutal with its difficulty. Everything I just said is why the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time is the hardest dungeon in the entire Zelda series. And there you have it, folks. That was my list of what I think are the top 10 hardest dungeons in The Legend of Zelda. Be sure to leave a comment with your own list, since I'm always interested, and I'm not just saying that. The script took a couple of weeks to write, so I would appreciate it if you would leave a like on this video. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you all next time.